The most dangerous thing in the sky that morning wasn't a Russian fighter. It wasn't a surface-to-air missile battery either. It was something far smaller, far quieter, and far more unexpected. A Ukrainian strike pilot would discover that the hard way. By the time the first warning tone screamed inside his cockpit, he was already deep inside the most drone-saturated airspace on Earth, flying a mission that intelligence believed was survivable. What followed would force a desperate fight through drones, missiles, electronic warfare, and physics itself. And it began at 6:12 local time. A Ukrainian MiG-29 was racing east at 900 km per hour, hugging the ground so tightly that the frozen countryside beneath him blurred into streaks of gray and brown. The aircraft was flying a low-altitude strike mission against a key bridge, threading through a narrow corridor that planners believed had minimal enemy activity. The plan depended on speed and terrain masking. The pilot's route began in friendly rear areas before entering the gray zone, the unpredictable region where control shifted constantly between Ukrainian and Russian forces. From there, he had roughly 35 kilometers to the weapon release point, about 15 minutes of extremely low flight through airspace that intelligence had carefully mapped and ground controllers had supposedly deconflicted. It wasn't empty. Above him, between 100 and 300 meters, Ukrainian and Russian reconnaissance drones floated across the front line, quietly tracking movement. Below that layer, at 20 to 50 meters, FPV attack drones hunted targets on both sides of the war. The MiG-29 was flying directly between those two layers. At about 50 meters altitude, he was threading the narrow gap where friendly drones had been temporarily grounded and Russian activity was believed to be minimal. Then the cockpit warning system screamed. The tone was wrong. Not the rhythmic pulse of search radar. Not the urgent warning of a radar-guided missile lock. Just a single sharp tone. Something was already guiding on him. A missile was already in the air, and he had never seen the launch. The pilot reacted instantly. Stick back. Throttle forward. Flares blasting into the freezing slipstream behind the aircraft. The MiG pitched upward as G-forces slammed him into his seat. His altitude jumped from 100 meters to 150, then 200. He was sacrificing invisibility for survival. The logic was simple. At low altitude, terrain hid him from radar, but if a missile was already chasing him, climbing might give him enough energy to outrun it. For several seconds, he waited for the explosion. Nothing came. No impact. No detonation. Whatever had been tracking him disappeared inside the cloud of flares. But the climb had created a new problem. At 300 meters, he was suddenly visible to everything. His radar warning receiver lit up instantly. A buck battery somewhere to the south began painting him with radar energy. An S-300 system somewhere to the east also appeared on his display. He had escaped one threat and flown straight into two others. Then he saw the shapes, two of them. About 3 kilometers away, slowly circling against the pale morning sky. Delta-wing silhouettes with roughly 3-5-meter wingspans moving slowly, loitering, turning toward him. The pilot felt the color drain from his face. Geran 2 drones. He had been briefed about this. In December, Russian forces had begun experimenting with a disturbing new tactic. Reconnaissance drones were being modified into aerial hunters by attaching R-60 air-to-air missiles beneath their wings. The purpose was simple. Kill Ukrainian aircraft flying low-altitude strike missions, exactly like the one he was flying right now. The R-60 was an infrared-guided missile. That meant his radar warning receiver couldn't detect the launch. The missile that had just tried to kill him had likely dropped silently from one of those drones, guided only by the heat of his engines. No radar, no warning, just a heat seeker falling out of the sky. The two drones were now turning directly toward him. If they still had missiles left, the pilot was about to find out. He rolled hard and pushed the nose down, dumping flares in wide arcs behind the aircraft while trying to break their angle of attack. At 200 meters, he was still dangerously exposed. Below him, the buck radar continued tracking, calculating a firing solution. But the drones were above him now. Climbing higher risked a radar-guided missile. Dropping lower risked giving the drones a perfect shot at his engines. Then the sky flashed white. A second launch. The pilot shoved the stick forward and dove for the deck. The MiG-29's engine screamed as he pushed the throttle into afterburner. Flares streamed behind him like a burning comet tail. Fortunately, the R-60 was an old missile. Its seeker was first-generation infrared guidance, easily distracted and far from intelligent. At 40 meters altitude, the jet leveled out so low that individual fence posts blurred past beneath the cockpit. The missile chased the brightest heat source it could see, and the flares were brighter than the aircraft. Seconds later, the missile detonated harmlessly behind him. Above, the Geran drones resumed their slow orbit, now out of ammunition. They could no longer attack him themselves, but they could still do something far worse. They could report his position. The pilot exhaled slowly. He was alive, but his evasive maneuver had pushed him north of the planned corridor into airspace that had never been cleared. His heading was wrong. His altitude was wrong. And when he keyed his radio for instructions, the response came through in fragments. Corridor compromised, working alternate. Then static. The busiest battlefield in the world had just gone silent, and suddenly the pilot was alone. He checked his navigation. The bridge target still lay 22 kilometers to the east. The mission was still valid. All he had to do was reach it. Through airspace nobody had cleared. Through airspace nobody could see. He pushed the throttle forward and turned east. And that's when he saw them. Dozens of FPV drones crossing his flight path at the same altitude. Small, fast, dark shapes slicing across the gray morning sky. At 900 km/h, he was closing on them at 250 meters per second. And there was absolutely nothing he could do. He flew straight into the swarm. And what waited inside it was even worse. The MiG-29 slammed forward through the air at 900 kilometers per hour, and suddenly the sky in front of the pilot wasn't empty anymore. It was moving. Small shapes flickered across the canopy. Some passed beneath him. Others shot above the aircraft or darted across his nose before disappearing behind him. They were so small and so fast that by the time his brain recognized what he had seen, the drones were already gone. He had just flown directly into a drone highway. At this speed, the math was terrifying. The jet was covering 250 meters every second. A drone appearing even 500 meters ahead would give him barely 2 seconds to react. Most of the time he had far less. And reaction didn't guarantee survival, because the drones themselves were small enough to be nearly invisible. The FPV strike drones flying across the sector were only about 30 centimeters across. From a distance, they looked like dark dinner plates with rotors. Against the gray winter sky, they were almost impossible to see until they were already dangerously close. The pilot scanned the airspace desperately. His N019 radar was useless. It had been built to track fighter jets and large aerial targets, not objects with the radar signature of a hot dog. His infrared search and track system wasn't helping either. Cold plastic frames and lithium batteries barely produced a heat signature. Every sensor in his cockpit had been designed for a different kind of war. The only detection system that mattered now was his own eyesight, and human eyesight simply wasn't built for this. The radio crackled again. Vector 090. Heavy activity above 60 meters, stay below 50. The message came through in pieces, but the meaning was clear. Above 60 meters, the airspace was even worse. He nudged the stick forward and dropped to 45 meters, the ground now rushing beneath him in a blurred streak of frozen farmland. At this altitude, the dangers multiplied. Power lines, cell towers, and something far more insidious. Russian drone operators had begun using fiber optic cables trailing behind some FPV drones, thin wires that allowed them to maintain control without relying on radio signals. Photographs from the front showed these cables draped across ruined buildings like spider silk. If one of those wires struck the aircraft intake, it could shred the compressor instantly, and the pilot would never even see it. Another broken transmission cut through the static. Ukrainian interceptors active. Airspace contested, recommended. His own side's drones were now entering the same airspace. Ukrainian interceptor drones chasing Russian strike drones, adding even more moving objects to a sky that was already packed. Ground control was trying to guide him through it, but their situational picture was already outdated. At 900 km/h, information that was 3 minutes old might as well have been ancient history. A shadow suddenly flashed across his peripheral vision. Close. Too close. An FPV drone streaked across his path maybe 50 meters away, crossing from left to right. He didn't even have time to react before it vanished behind him. Then another shape flashed below him, almost skimming the frozen ground. Then several more appeared ahead, scattered across the sky like dark specks. The pilot made a decision. He couldn't stay down here. Every second in this altitude band was a roll of the dice against a collision. The bridge target was still 15 kilometers ahead, and the longer he stayed inside this swarm, the worse the odds became. There was only one way out, up. He shoved the throttle through the detent and into full afterburner. The MiG-29 roared as raw fuel ignited in the exhaust, the engines pushing the aircraft forward with brutal acceleration. The jet surged past 1,000 kilometers per hour. Then the pilot pulled back on the stick. The MiG began climbing hard. He was punching out of the drone swarm the only way possible, by trading invisible threats for visible ones. The radar warning receiver exploded with signals almost instantly. A Buck surface-to-air missile battery had found him. The Fire Dome tracking radar locked onto the aircraft, bathing it in the energy required to guide a missile straight into the cockpit. The climb continued. 500 meters, 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters. The radar never lost him. Somewhere below, the Buck system was calculating where the MiG would be in the next few seconds. The maneuver he was preparing was something few modern pilots ever practiced anymore: a toss bombing attack. The technique dated back to the Cold War, when fighter bombers needed to deliver gravity bombs without flying directly over heavily defended targets. The idea was simple: climb steeply, release the bomb at the top of the climb. Let the weapon's momentum carry it toward the target while the aircraft immediately dives away. It worked well on training ranges. It worked well in theory, but the textbooks assumed something very important: a clear threat environment, and the airspace over Pokrovsk was anything but clear. The pilot held the climb, 2,500 meters, 3,000 meters. At any moment the Buck system could fire. If that happened, he might have 8 seconds to react. But aborting the attack meant flying back through the drone swarm with nothing accomplished. The mission was still valid. The bridge was still standing. Ukrainian ground forces were counting on him. He continued climbing, 3,500 meters. The tablet mounted in his cockpit, his iPad flight reference showed the release parameters approaching. The radar was still tracking him, still calculating. The pilot understood something with cold clarity. He was betting his life on a math equation. Could he release the bombs and dive below the radar horizon before the missile reached him? 4,000 meters. The tablet flashed yellow, close enough. His thumb hit the weapon release. 2 heavy thuds shook the aircraft as the AASM Hammer bombs dropped away from the MiG, but the pilot wasn't watching them fall. He was already moving, because somewhere below him, a Buck launcher had just fired, and the missile racing toward him was traveling 4 times faster than sound. The missile was already in the air. Somewhere to the south, a Buck M3 launcher had fired a 9M317M surface-to-air missile, and it was accelerating toward the MiG-29 at nearly Mach 4. Inside the cockpit, the pilot didn't see the launch. He didn't see the missile either. But his radar warning receiver screamed, the unmistakable tone of a missile already tracking him. The aircraft was still climbing through 4,000 meters when the pilot began the next phase of the maneuver. He shoved the stick forward. The MiG rolled inverted. Then he pulled through a violent split-S dive, sending the aircraft plunging back toward the Earth. Altitude converted instantly into speed. The horizon flipped in the canopy as the jet pointed almost straight down. Behind him, the 2 AASM Hammer bombs ignited their rocket motors, bright flashes kicking them forward along their attack trajectory. Each bomb accelerated toward Mach 08, beginning the 15-kilometer flight toward the bridge. But the pilot couldn't watch. His entire world was now the ground rushing toward him. The 9M317M missile chasing him was guided by semi-active radar homing. That meant it didn't carry its own radar transmitter. Instead, it followed reflected radar energy from the fire dome illuminator that was painting the MiG-29 from the ground. The principle was simple, like a cat chasing a laser pointer across the wall. The missile followed the brightest reflection. And right now, the MiG-29 was the brightest object in the sky. The only way to break that guidance was to break the radar illumination itself, which meant dropping below the radar horizon. The pilot quickly ran the numbers in his head. The missile was closing at roughly 1,400 meters per second. Distance to impact was roughly 8 kilometers. That meant about 6 seconds before it arrived. Maybe 7. The dive continued. 3,500 meters. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 3,000, 2,500. Aircraft began to buffet as it approached the limits of controllability. Airframe vibrations rattled through the cockpit as the MiG sliced downward at extreme speed. 2,000 meters. The pilot stayed focused. Leveling too early meant the radar would still see him, and the missile would still hit. 1,500 meters. Below him, the frozen Ukrainian countryside became sharply detailed. Individual fields, scattered buildings, and tree lines appeared through the canopy. The ground was rising fast. 1,000 meters. The aircraft was now screaming toward the terrain. The missile behind him continued closing. The fire dome radar still illuminated the aircraft. The guidance computer inside the missile kept adjusting its trajectory, predicting exactly where the MiG would be seconds ahead. Then the pilot finally began to pull. At 600 meters altitude, he yanked back on the stick. G-forces slammed into him instantly. His body compressed against the ejection seat as the MiG's wings fought to carve a new flight path through the dense winter air. His vision began to gray, but he held the pull, because pulling too early meant death. The aircraft leveled out at roughly 200 meters above the ground, racing west at maximum dry thrust. Inside the cockpit, the radar warning receiver still screamed. The fire dome radar was still searching, still illuminating, still trying to guide the missile. Then suddenly, nothing. The radar signal disappeared. The MiG-29 had dropped below the radar horizon. The radar beam could no longer see him. And without that reflected energy, the 9M317M missile lost its guidance. The missile's computer executed its final emergency command. It pitched upward slightly, attempting to reacquire a target while its proximity fuse armed, searching for anything to detonate near. But there was nothing. 3 seconds later, the missile exploded 300 meters above the countryside, scattering fragments across empty frozen fields. The MiG-29 continued west. The pilot exhaled. He was alive, but the mission wasn't finished. Behind him, the 2 AASM Hammer bombs were still flying toward the bridge. Each weapon had separated cleanly from the aircraft. Their rocket motors burned for roughly 15 seconds, accelerating them along a ballistic arc toward the target coordinates. The bombs were sophisticated weapons. Each one combined 3 systems in a single package. In the nose sat a GPS guidance receiver and ring laser gyroscopes. In the center was the solid rocket motor. At the tail, control fins constantly adjusted the bomb's trajectory, making corrections up to 50 times per second. Under ideal conditions, the AASM could deliver 250 kilograms of explosive through a specific window from 70 kilometers away. But the battlefield around Pokrovsk was not ideal. For months, Russian electronic warfare systems had blanketed the region with R-330 Zhitl jamming stations, aggressively disrupting satellite navigation signals. Every precision weapon entering this sector experienced the same problem. JDAMER bombs drifting off target, GPS-guided artillery shells missing by dozens of meters, drone navigation failing entirely. The jamming was constant. Inside the bomb's guidance packages, the military-grade GPS receivers fought to maintain signal lock. They were hardened systems, far more resistant than civilian receivers. But resistance wasn't immunity. Gradually, the GPS signal degraded. Position errors began to accumulate, first centimeters, then meters. Inside the bomb's computer, the software recognized the problem and switched to the backup system, the ring laser gyroscopes. From the moment of release, the gyroscopes had been measuring acceleration and rotation, building a purely mathematical estimate of position. No satellites required, just physics. But inertial navigation had a weakness. Accuracy slowly degraded over time. With GPS guidance active, the bomb could strike within 1 meter of the target. With inertial navigation alone, accuracy dropped to around 10 meters, still deadly, but no longer perfect. And that meant the outcome now depended on probability, a direct hit or a near miss. Back in the cockpit, the pilot was facing his own probability problem, because he still had to fly home, and the only route home led directly back into the drone swarm. The pilot dropped back down to 40 meters and pointed the MiG-29 west. The only way home was through the same airspace he had barely escaped minutes earlier. The safe corridor no longer existed. Ground control had already confirmed it. The drone traffic, electronic warfare, and air defense systems had turned the entire sector into something closer to chaos than controlled airspace, and he had to fly straight through it. At 900 km per hour, the MiG tore across the frozen landscape, the ground flashing beneath him so quickly it almost looked like a river of gray ice. Every second he traveled roughly 250 meters, and every second meant another chance of colliding with a drone he couldn't see. The swarm was still there. FPV drones darted across the sky in unpredictable paths. Ukrainian interceptors chasing Russian strike drones. Russian drones heading toward Ukrainian lines. Machines hunting machines. And in the middle of it, one man in a fighter jet. His radio continued cutting in and out. Ground control was still trying to build a safe vector for him, but the picture they were working with was already outdated. Drone operators launched new aircraft constantly, and every minute the airspace changed. At these speeds, information that was even 1 minute old could get him killed. The pilot kept his eyes locked on the sky ahead. Every shadow mattered. Every flicker of movement could be the last thing he ever saw. A dark shape flashed across his nose at roughly 100 meters. Then another streak below him, skimming across the frozen fields. The MiG passed through their wake before the pilot's hands even had time to react. He didn't turn. He didn't slow down. Turning meant losing speed. Slowing down meant spending longer inside the swarm. The only option was forward. His radio crackled again. Impact 30 seconds, track nominal. The bombs were still flying. 15 kilometers behind the aircraft, the 2 AASM Hammer bombs were racing toward the bridge. Their rocket motors had burned out long ago, leaving the weapons gliding forward along their ballistic arc. Inside each bomb, the ring laser gyroscopes continued calculating position with relentless precision. No satellites, no external signals, just mathematics and inertia guiding the weapons through the jamming environment. But the margin for error remained. With GPS guidance degraded, the bombs were now operating on inertial navigation alone. Accuracy had dropped from 1 meter to around 10 meters. That difference meant everything. 10 meters could mean the difference between hitting the bridge structure or striking the river beside it. The pilot's survival odds and the bomb's success now depended on the same thing: probability. His radio crackled again. 20 seconds. Ahead of him, another drone crossed the sky. This one was closer, maybe 50 meters. It darted across his path from right to left. The pilot jerked the stick instinctively, a small correction that came too late to matter. The drone had already vanished behind him. He kept flying. 10 seconds. The density of drones finally began thinning as he approached Ukrainian-controlled airspace. The electronic warfare interference also weakened slightly, allowing his radio to come through more clearly. Ground control returned. Roadrunner 24, impact imminent, Standby for BDA. 5 seconds. The MiG-29 crossed back into friendly airspace at 6:17 local time. The aircraft was still racing west at roughly 800 km per hour, fuel warning lights glowing amber on the cockpit panel. The pilot never saw the explosion. He was already 20 kilometers away, but he heard the call. Impact, impact. 15 kilometers behind him, the two AASM Hammer bombs struck the eastern span of the Pokrovsk Bridge less than half a second apart. The first bomb punched through roughly 18 inches of reinforced concrete before detonating inside the structure. The explosion shattered the bridge's internal supports, sending cracks racing through the span. A fraction of a second later, the second bomb arrived. It struck a section already weakened by the first detonation. The structure collapsed. Concrete and steel cascaded into the frozen river below. For 3 weeks, Russian forces had been using that bridge as a staging point for repeated assaults across the sector. Vehicles, supplies, and troop movements depended on it. In seconds, it was gone, and the MiG-29 pilot who had delivered the strike was already disappearing into the distance, flying home through the gray morning sky. One aircraft, one mission, one bridge destroyed. And a battlefield where the sky itself had become the most dangerous place on Earth. Subscribe for more military insights, tech breakdowns, and updates.